Hello and welcome back to the Debatable Discussions podcast. Today you join us for a very exciting episode as me and Diane will have a short but hopefully quite insightful discussion about philosophy and in particular a few sort of delving into a few topics in the realm of metaphysics.
So, for those of you who don't know, metaphysics is a branch of philosophy which deals with sort of the more abstract questions of philosophy. So, it's quite an abstract field. It's not a practical field of philosophy, such as, for example, epistemology. It's a bit more practical. Metaphysics is about as abstract as you can get. And today we're going to be speaking mainly on two topics, which is identity and time. But before that, I'd like to let John first introduce the first topic, the Ship of Theseus. Could you quickly explain what that is, John?
So, as I'm sure our listeners know, Theseus is a legendary Greek hero, a very famous figure in Greek mythology. And this sort of parable or story around Theseus is, let's say Theseus has one of his ships preserved in a museum. As things do, the wood will decay over time. So, to preserve the ship, the museum replaces each decayed plank with a new one. However, the museum does this over a long period of time, and eventually the ship is totally replaced with new pieces of wood and new planks of wood. So, Diane, the big question this beckons is this totally replaced Ship of Theseus still the original ship?
Well. I think, is this the original ship? No. But the actual question, John, here, I think, is it the same ship?
Yeah.
Could you say that the ship being replaced, is that the same ship? And I think there's arguments for and against. I think that for me, my instinct doesn't really tell me much this time. It tells me yes and no. I think this is for two reasons. Number one, I think if, for example, we swap the ship out, for example, with a person with a prosthetic leg is still the same person. However, the question then is, what if a person had everything changed about them? Do they still have the same personality, character? And are they the same? Probably not. And I think that is mostly to do with the fact that each particular plank tells a story.
Yeah.
You know, that plank going through that journey, through those waters, maybe it's a bit moist, maybe it's a bit broken, it tells a story. It tells the story that this voyage has happened, you know? And the new plank loses all that story, loses all the character that story brings the plank. And it's also quite an abstract object. You can't really ask it.
Yeah.
But I do think it's almost as if it depends whether Theseus would believe so. For example, I think I'm going to give the example of a watch. You get an old watch. You know, it's old, you need to change its strap. Then you need to send it in to a watchmaker to make sure that the sort of mechanism, the cogs, are all working properly. Maybe some need to be changed, they need to be cleaned. Maybe the dial's a bit broken, maybe you need a new dial. You need some new hands, maybe, because they're a bit rusty. Is it the same watch? I would argue that is the same watch because, again, it tells a story. It tells a story of change. It tells a story of you growing up, being older, and wearing that watch. I don't know if that can be applied to the ship, however, because we don't have an owner.
I sort of see where you're coming from there. However, I sort of disagree and agree in certain areas. But what I quite enjoyed was your analogy about the human body. And it sort of brought this idea into my mind of the difference between something being the same and something being identical. Because, Diane, you're the biologist here, but I'd imagine as a human grows, we have new cells.
Of
And we
course,
get rid of
yes.
old cells. And that's almost like the Ship of Theseus in a way. Our old, I guess, planks of wood,
Yes.
they get replaced. And so we're not identical to how we were, but we are the same entity. However, we've just changed.
Yes, indeed.
And I imagine
Indeed.
almost that's, could you say, evolution in life is similar to the ship. perhaps something can be the same
Yeah.
entity, but just in a different form.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you there. I think that's a fantastic point they made in that our body parts, our cells, everything from our cells that carry blood to our white blood cells that help us not die when we get a cold, to all the cells in our body constantly dividing, basically creating new cells. And that is vital to replenish, make sure all cells are new and healthy,
Yeah,
almost as if you would change a plank. But there is a sort of immovable character. Your character doesn't change. The new cells don't impact your character because you've got, I don't want to say we have free will because I think that will just go into a whole nother direction, which I think we should avoid for today. But I also don't want to say we have a soul because that as well will also derail the
I was
subject.
about to actually say that in the next thing I'll say, but maybe you could lightly touch on the idea of a soul. Just thinking about how we can change, but I mean, you believe in the idea of a soul, Diane, but do you not believe that our
Yeah.
soul changes and evolves as well?
Yeah, so I think the definition of a soul is one that's really controversial among not only philosophers but also just the general public. I've There are people who say that the soul is sort of your defining set of characteristics. I, on the other hand, would define it as the sum of all your experiences, characters, emotions, and past experiences you have had. Your
Okay.
soul constantly evolves and changes. And I think this is very clear in the case of some people. I mean, if you look at, I don't know, the gang members, right? I don't think you can say that a 1-year-old Al Capone has the same soul that a 50-year-old Al Capone had. Because in that 50 years, so many atrocities have happened that it leaves a mark. It changes your way of thinking, your way of operating in the world. I think that's what your soul is. Your soul is the sort of sum of your experiences that dictates how you view and how you interact with life and those around you. Now, us changing ourselves does not change our soul.
Yeah,
But does the ship changing its planks change its soul? Well, maybe. Because for us, one cell is something we can't see. It's not a
yeah,
noticeable change. On the other hand, a plank, especially one that's, I don't know, maybe the wheel, that's quite an important sort of artifact. It's like almost if you had a brain transplant.
yeah,
That wouldn't make it the same. People with heart transplants, this is actually quite interesting. If you receive a heart from someone who's a smoker, you are quite likely to begin smoking as well because your heart demands it. On the other hand, you're also quite likely to not smoke if you receive a new heart or not drink if you receive a new liver because of the fear of damaging that as well.
yeah,
But that is a change in your behavior. If you're a really heavy drinker and you receive a transplanted liver and you say, I'm not going to touch a drop of alcohol for the rest of my life, that is a change in your soul. That is a character change. That is a different way of you approaching life, in my opinion, at least.
yeah. I really like that idea there, and I think that's actually a very good point that you brought up. In that, the analogy I sort of gave of the human body being like the ship isn't perhaps necessarily right, because the ship, it doesn't expand like the human body does. Nothing is being added to; it's rather just being
Yeah,
replaced. And part of the human soul, you could say, as you said, if you believe in a soul, it's adding these new experiences. It's almost growing and not replacing per se, but your cells,
yeah,
you know, enlarging as your soul does. However, the ship, on the other hand, if we take this analogy, being a new museum, these, as you say, Dan, these new wooden planks, they don't tell a new story. And it would be of perhaps detriment to, let's say, if this ship has a soul or the entity of the ship. It takes away part of that history, literally. It sort of brings you back to a debate of, I think, someone interested in history, does it become a replica? Because it lacks the true essence. It lacks, you can almost use the word, it lacks the soul of the real ship, which I think is quite interesting.
what do you think about that?
I think it's interesting. I would say actually, if you do replace all the wooden planks of a ship, it does become a replica, and that's total. I think there's an argument you can make for: is it a renovated? Yes, but I think if something's renovated, then it's still got this idea of some original parts being present. So I think perhaps along the process, the ship is renovated. However, it achieves a state where it's just a replica because there is no part of that real ship. And it lacks, as you said, that meaning, that identity behind it. I will also quickly mention today's sponsor for this episode, which is the Free Speech Union, and in particular, the McTaggart Programme. The McTaggart Programme is a grant giving program administered by the Free Speech Union and aims to promote free speech and open debate among young people aged 16 to 13. In the 2 years, the McTaggart Programme has supported an array of new and existing student societies as well as a range of individual awards that seek to promote free speech, like the Debatable Discussions podcast. The programme is not just interested in supporting formal debates. It has also supported students to set up their own podcasts, as me and Diane have, create video content, organise socials on campus, or even in their local area, and travel to events elsewhere in the country. They are open to hearing about ideas for performances, exhibitions, research projects, and other creative endeavours. The Free Speech Union's remit is very flexible as long as recipients of funding adopt an open and inquiring attitude towards ideas, their own and those of others. To find out more about the programme and apply, please visit thefreespeechunion.org/grants.
Yeah, I think that's actually really important because we are in a world where dialogue is becoming less and less the norm.
Yeah.
It is much more usual to simply end the conversation at the moment of disagreement. And that's really unhealthy for a multitude of reasons. I'm really happy that, we are doing this here and we can sort of better ourselves by disagreeing with each other and learning some stuff from one another as well as having all these guests who some of them I do agree with, some of them I don't. I'm sure you feel the same. But it is really vital for our society to develop that these conversations are being held.
Yes, and so a big thank you to the Free Speech Union for supporting the podcast and this episode. Shifting back to the realm of metaphysics, Diane, perhaps should we delve into our next topic? And this is quite a deep one for listeners. However, I encourage you to keep on listening because I think it will be just as interesting as the Ship of Theseus. Let's look at the idea of time, something that obviously governs our lives. It governs history. It governs pretty much all understanding. So, Diane, I'll dive right in and I'll ask you, is time meaningful without events? Does time depend on events or can it exist on its own?
I do feel like this is going to be one of those questions we disagree. I, on one hand, do believe that time exists independently of events. I do think the example of sleep is what I'm going to use. When you are sleeping for 5 hours, you're not doing anything.
Yeah.
You yourself, your point of view of time, nothing is happening. However, you wake up and you say, okay, 6 hours have gone, 7 hours have gone. Time has passed whilst you're unconscious and weren't able to understand and realize that there was a change in the passing of time. So that's my argument. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I find that interesting there because I agree and think on that level you're talking about, on, could you say, more of a micro personal level, you can sleep and there is no event whilst you're sleeping almost. So you're trying to say that means time. You wouldn't know what the time is, let's say, when you woke up. However, thinking on a larger scale, I do think time, or how we perceive time, is governed by events. And I mean, I think the best example of showing this is calendars. So
Yeah.
currently we prescribe, our system of time is based on an event. It's based on the birth of Jesus. And from that, we prescribe that Jesus was born, well, now 2025 years ago. And we conclude that in one of those years away from Jesus' death, there's 365 days. But the macro, the big idea around this is that we are measuring time based on a religious event. And so I think, and this religious event influences all of history in the sense that we judge all other events against the same core event, Jesus Christ's death. And that then can influence morality and things. So I think on that macro level, it's perhaps not, is time meaningful without events? Perhaps I'm not answering the question the best, but I do feel that how we perceive time, that relies on events. What do you have to say about that, Dan?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do fully agree with you there. I do think that the way we perceive time is bound to events because, I don't want to give this example because it may seem quite plain, but if you're in a really boring lesson,
Yeah.
it does feel like it just drags on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
However, if you're, I don't know, playing sport or watching a really interesting film, time passes a lot quicker. And I think our perception and the way we see and sort of, don't want to say realize, but the way we sort of realize that time has passed is very dependent on the things we're doing, on the events that are happening around us. But I do also think time itself has meaning without events. I'm going to propose this thought experiment that everyone decide, okay, we're going to go to sleep at 2 p.m. UK time for an hour. Time has passed in that hour. No one's doing anything because everyone's sleeping.
Okay.
Therefore, I don't think how you can say that time is bound by an event. Okay, that's unrealistic, but if you think about it, it's a possible thing. It's not like I'm going to say that on a fly.
Yeah.
What do you think, John?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I understand what you mean there in the sense that time can exist, as you say, almost independent of events. Like if everyone was sleeping, we're existing without this idea of an event. That sort of brings me on to another thing, Dan. That sort of is a nice link into perhaps another question on, is time an illusion? Have we invented, I mean, you're the scientist here, but is it an illusion? Is the passage of time an illusion? Have we just invented this belief that there are 24 hours a day? A second is obviously something we've invented. It's an invented unit of time. So, yeah, is time an illusion?
Yeah, well, I think the answer yes and no. I mean, there are, the way we measure a second is because of a radioactive particle, which I'm going to search out. Why is a second a second? And it is from the radioactive sort of, so the duration of, it is because of the cesium-133 atom. So since 1967, the second. So it does have to do with sort of chemistry/physics.
Yeah.
But we've developed that system a lot earlier than that.
Right, yeah.
I do think, for example, that time, as you said, well, it's obviously made up. I don't know. I don't think anyone can make a solid, well-reasoned argument that there are 24 hours in a day and not 23 or 25. Millions of years ago, there are 25 hours in a day. Everyone would believe me. Just as if I decided that, I don't know, Monday's actually the third day of the week instead of the first.
Yeah.
And that Saturday is the second day of the week. That's obviously made up. You know, these terms are obviously made up. However, do they have a basis in reality? I do think so, because if you look at the way it's sort of like the period the sun is out in the summer, it does kind of make sense to use that clock where you have a large period of time. I don't know if it's 12 or 14. I think it's about sort of 16 hours of sunshine a day.
Yeah.
So you've got your 7-8 hours of dark where you're supposed to sleep, and your 16, 17 roughly hours of sunshine where you're supposed to be active.
I agree with you there. And actually, as you've taught there, you've actually sort of convinced me that time really is an illusion. And how do we, if someone, let's say, 1,000 years ago said there are 26 hours in a day, I think that would have continued. And perhaps as the
Oh
finishing
yeah.
mark of the episode, I'll give a sort of analogy which you just made me think of there, and it's that China famously has one time zone. So there are people in China who obviously understand sunset as not necessarily being the start of their day. So the sunset may happen in China, or perhaps obviously the sunset doesn't happen at midday, but their perception of time according to the sun is totally different. And it's not actually an accurate perception of time. So that goes to show that
Yes,
time
indeed.
really is an illusion because they're not perceiving time accurately according to science. They're perceiving it according to, let's say, a social construct.
Well, I mean, where our calendar has begun is, frankly, it's Julius Caesar
Yeah.
ordered the Julian calendar to be made instead of the Gregorian calendar. So the reason that July is called July is as a tribute to Caesar.
Yeah.
And August is named after Augustus.
Oh, yeah.
So, also known as Octavian. So, these are made up things. The fact that a month has 30 days, apart from February, has got 28.
Yeah.
The fact that January's got 31 days and that November's got 30 days, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see any evidence where someone can genuinely come with pure science and tell me, look, this is why November should have 30 days and January 31. This is why July is July. This is why July should be called July.
Yeah.
After Caesar. Yeah. It was all made in Caesar's time as a consul and emperor of the Roman Empire. Not dictator, technically, but these are societal constructs. We've just kept them. And who is to say that in 5,000 years people won't think we're crazy for having 7 weeks in a day? I mean, I don't know if you saw, but I just saw a couple of weeks ago this guy online saying he's got 21 days a week. Because each day for him is 6 hours.
Yeah. But it shows how it's
So,
a construct.
I mean,
yeah, you can construct your entire almost. It is an illusion. Yeah.
Yes,
So,
I do think, time is one of those things that is real, but also the way we measure it and the way we relate to it isn't.
it's not, yeah. Oh, so with that, we will conclude this episode. Perhaps, Dan, could you quickly summarize what we've sort of delved into today?
Yeah, so today we discussed two big topics in metaphysics, which are identity, where we use the example of the Ship of Theseus as a ship removing all its parts. Is it the same ship? I think we made some good points there about comparisons to the human body, comparisons to just other beings, and why maybe a ship is a bit different to us in that regard. And we also, of course, discussed time. Is it real? Is it an illusion? And does time exist within or outside events? I hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, if you have, please do leave us a comment, leave us a review, follow the podcast, as well as watch any previous episode you would like. If you're more interested in the philosophy episodes, we've done a great episode a couple of months ago on Stoicism, on absurdism, as well as all our episodes with guests, with the likes Anthony Scaramucci being on the podcast, Vince Cable, and others.
So thank you everyone for listening, and do also follow us on all social media to hear more about the podcast. See you next week, Dan.
See you next week.